Okay, so you want to own a beekeeping operation, a few dozen white boxes in a sunny corner of the property, the low hum of the yard on a warm afternoon, jars of gold on the kitchen counter by August, and a business that seems to run itself as long as the weather cooperates. You picture yourself in a veil at golden hour, smoker in one hand, a frame dripping with capped honey in the other. It's not a bad picture. Bees really do build the product for you. Nobody has to plant, weed, or harvest a single flower. Here's the problem: you're picturing the 1 week of the year that lies to you the most. Because the truth is that a beekeeping operation is not really a honey business. It is a trucking company whose cargo happens to build its own inventory. And the moment you understand that, everything about how this business actually makes money and how it quietly goes broke starts to make sense. Here's the problem: most people price out a beehive, look at the honey it produces, and stop there. That number alone almost never pencils out. Wholesale honey brings in a few dollars a pound. A healthy colony makes maybe 50 pounds of it a year. And after the cost of the jars, the labels, and the hours spent extracting and bottling, a backyard scale hobby barely breaks even on paper, let alone funds a business. And that gap between what a stationary hive earns and what the real money in this industry looks like is not a rounding error. It's the whole business model hiding in plain sight. Now, here's where it gets dangerous because the answer isn't obvious, and almost nobody explains it correctly before you've already spent the money. Here's the reframe: a beekeeping operation is not a honey farm. It's a trucking company that rents out a fleet of pollinating labor for a living, and honey is just what that fleet happens to produce while it's parked between jobs. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the beekeepers who get rich are almost never the ones who make the best honey, and why that one idea explains the equipment you'll buy, the miles you'll drive, and the year that could wipe out 60% of everything you own overnight. Let's start with what it actually costs to get in the door, because there isn't one type of beekeeping operation. There are at least four, and each one is a different business wearing the same veil. At the bottom, the hobbyist, typically 25 colonies or fewer, keeping bees in the backyard mostly for the enjoyment of it, and a few jars of honey to give away. Above that, the sideliner, somewhere between 25 and 300 colonies, part time income on top of another job. Above that, the commercial operation, 300 colonies, and up, where beekeeping is the whole business. And at the very top, the migratory pollination fleet, hundreds to tens of thousands of colonies loaded onto flatbed trucks and driven across state lines chasing bloom season after bloom season. That top tier is a tiny fraction of all beekeepers and it controls almost the entire industry. Roughly 2% of American beekeepers manage about 88% of the country's colonies. That's not a typo, and we'll come back to exactly why in a few minutes. There are somewhere around 115 to 125,000 beekeepers in the United States, and the split between them tells you almost everything about where the money actually sits. Hobbyists and part timers together account for roughly 40% of the country's honey production. The remaining 60% comes from about 1,600 commercial operations. A tiny sliver of the total headcount produces the majority of the output, and an even tinier sliver of that sliver, the migratory pollination fleets, earns the disproportionate share of the actual profit because they're the ones who figured out that the honey was never the point. For now, the entry cost: a complete hive, the box, the frames, the foundation, and the bees themselves, whether you buy a package or an already established nucleus colony, your is bourse runs $150 to $250. Packages alone run $88 to $128. A nucleus colony, meaning bees that already have a laying queen and drawn comb, runs 90 to 150. A fully built double-story colony, the kind ready to go straight into an almond orchard, sells for closer to $275 to $320. If you wanted to build a real sideliner operation of 200 colonies from scratch, just the bees and the boxes, before a single truck or trailer, you are looking at somewhere around $30 to $50,000. And that's before the gear that has nothing to do with the bees themselves: a veil, gloves, a smoker, a hive tool, an extractor, and basic bottling supplies for even a small operation runs around $2,000. All in, Call that an illustrative starting figure for a couple of hives, not a rule. Scale that up to a real commercial operation. And you also need a truck and trailer capable of hauling stacked pallets of hives at night without waking up an entire neighborhood, which is its own capital outlay before you've driven a single mile toward an orchard. Here's the cost almost nobody budgets for correctly, and it isn't a piece of equipment, it's a grading inspection. If your business plan includes almond pollination, and for most serious operations, it has to, because that's where the real money lives. Your colonies don't just show up and get paid, they get inspected. Almond growers and their crop insurance require a documented minimum of 2 colonies with 6 active frames of bees per acre, or the equivalent. Read that again. Not 2 boxes. 2 colonies carrying a specific countable number of frames covered in live bees, checked by an inspector standing in the orchard before the payment is released. And there's a premium tier above that baseline. Between 2015 and 2019, pollination fees for colonies graded above 8 frames rose 9%, compared to 5% for the market overall. And the premium for exceeding that baseline strength grew from 2% to 6% above the standard rate. Growers in the stricter southern half of California's Central Valley paid an average of $196.34 per colony, compared to $190.41 in the less strict northern half. The same crop, the same season, a few dollars apart because of how many bees were physically standing on the frames the day the inspector walked the row. What that means in practice is this: you don't just need bees, you need bees at a specific countable strength on a specific date in February, regardless of how the winter treated them, which means extra feeding, extra protein patties, and extra attention in January, purely to make grade, money spent not to grow the colony, but to pass an exam. Stack that grading cost on top of the entry price in a 200 colony operation before trucks, before land, before a single almond bloom has already put somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 on the table. Now, here's the part of this business that actually explains everything else. Ask yourself a simple question. A single colony sits in your backyard all year, makes honey, and never leaves. Another identical colony gets loaded onto a truck in February, pollinates almonds, gets driven to a second crop in the spring, and then comes home to make honey in the summer. Which colony earns more money for its owner? The answer isn't close. And if you guessed the backyard colony because it's simpler and cheaper to run, you guessed wrong. Let's do the math on what this actually means. That stationary colony, the one that just sits and makes honey, produces on average about 48 pounds of honey a year at a 2025 average price of $3.05 a pound. That's roughly $146 of gross revenue for the entire year before you've paid for a single jar, a single label, or a single hour of extracting. Now take the exact same colony and put it on a truck. Almond pollination alone pays somewhere between $195 and $216 for 6 weeks of work in February. Add a second contract that spring, and the menu of options is longer than most people realize. Cucumbers pay around $67 a colony, canola around $59, cranberries close to $54, pears around $53.50, watermelon and even $50, cherries around $47, squash and pumpkins around $45, apples around $44, clover around $33.50. Even a modest second contract on top of almonds means that same box of bees has already out-earned its entire stationary counterpart before summer even starts. Then it comes home and makes the same 48 pounds of honey anyway. Stack it all together, and a migratory colony can bring in somewhere between $385 and $430 across a season. That's 2.5 to 3 times what the same bees earn standing still. Let that land for a moment. The honey isn't the product. It never really was. It's the byproduct, what a rented colony produces on its own time, in between the jobs that actually pay the bills. This is why 2% of beekeepers control 88% of the country's hives. It isn't that a handful of people are secretly better at keeping bees alive, it's that they industrialize the logistics. One of the largest operations in the country, 80 honey farms, built roughly 2/3 of its entire annual revenue on almond pollination contracts, not on honey at all. And here's the structural conclusion that follows from that. If the money is in the truck route and not in the hive, then your biggest competitive advantage was never going to be your bees. It was going to be your trailer, your route, and your contracts. A beekeeping operation at any serious scale is a logistics company that happens to keep livestock. The honey on the label is real. It's also almost incidental to how the owner actually got paid. So far, so good. Now let's talk about the grind that sits underneath all of that stacked revenue, because every one of those contracts comes with a bill attached, and the bills arrive whether the bees cooperate or not. Feed is the first one. Bees don't magically survive the gaps between blooms. In early spring and again in autumn, colonies typically need 1.5 to 8 gallons of sugar syrup at $3.30 to $4.39 a gallon, plus up to 6 pounds of protein patties in spring and another 4 to 8 pounds in autumn at $1.09 to $1.57 a pound. Add it up across 2 feeding seasons, and you're looking at roughly $25 to $80 a colony every single year just to keep them strong enough to survive the trip and pass the almond inspection. Then there's requeening. Queens wear out, get injured, or simply stop laying well enough to keep a colony competitive, and a mated replacement queen runs $24 to $75. Multiply that across a few hundred colonies that need replacement queens in a given year, and it's a real line item, not a footnote. And then there's the cost that sits at the center of almost everything that can go wrong in this business: the Varroa mite. Every serious operation treats for mites multiple times a year, typically running 2 to 4 different products in rotation. Amitraz strips at roughly $5.50 to $8.50. Formic acid treatments around $2 to $5. Hop beta acid strips at $4 to $6.50. Oxalic acid vapor at a quarter a treatment. Thymol tablets at under $2. None of these individually sound dramatic. Run several of them per colony, twice a year, across a few hundred colonies, and mite control alone becomes one of the largest recurring line items in the operation, year after year, forever, because the mite never actually goes away. It just gets managed. Here's a structural fork worth naming directly: stationary versus migratory. A stationary operation avoids the fuel, the interstate health certificates, and the risk of the road, but it's stuck earning honey only money. A migratory operation earns 2 to 3 times more per colony, but every mile adds cost and risk. An interstate transport permit and health certificate run roughly $100 to $200 per load, and shipping a colony a long distance, say from the Northeast to California, can cost up to $50 a colony, compared to $10 to $14 from somewhere closer, like the Pacific Northwest. The farther you are from the bloom, the more of your almond check gets eaten by the truck before you ever see it. And here's the weird but true digression that ties this whole beat together. As pollination fees climbed and a single hive's rental value rose past $200, roughly 10 times what it cost to rent the same box of bees in the 1970s, beekeeping stopped looking like agriculture to a certain kind of criminal and started looking like a target. Recorded thefts in California almond country tell the story on their own. About 128 hives stolen in 2013, climbing to well over 1,000 hives a year at the peak in 2016 and 2017, then settling to 300 in 2018, 542 in 2019, and 639 in 2020. Organized rings now operate during bloom season using the same flatbed trucks and forklifts that legitimate operators use to move hives, loading several hundred colonies onto a truck in under 20 minutes in the dark and disappearing before the owner even notices they're gone. One beekeeper's anti-theft tracking equipment alone would have cost him more than $50,000 to fully protect his fleet. That's the lesson buried in this digression. When an asset's rental value multiplies tenfold in 50 years, it stops behaving like livestock and starts behaving like cargo worth stealing. And the cost of protecting it becomes just one more line on the budget nobody accounted for on day one. Now let's talk about whether this business can actually survive, because the honest answer, in a bad year, is sometimes not. In January 2025, commercial beekeepers across the country started reporting something they'd never seen before: entire yards of colonies collapsing within weeks, far beyond the normal winter dieback. USDA's Bee Research Laboratory in Beltsville tested the dead colonies and found the cause: deformed wing virus, and acute bee paralysis virus carried by varroa mites. And when researchers tested those mites for resistance to amitraz, the single most widely used miticide in American beekeeping, virtually every sample came back resistant. Read that again. The primary chemical tool the entire industry had leaned on for years to control its single biggest recurring cost had quietly stopped working nationwide, and nobody found out until the colonies were already dead. Commercial beekeepers lost more than 60% of their colonies since the previous summer, roughly 1.7 million colonies gone, for an estimated financial impact of $600 million. A Washington State University pollinator ecologist summed up what that meant on the ground in one sentence. For a lot of these operators, another year of big losses, and they're out of business. And the stakes here reach well past the beekeepers themselves. Honeybees pollinate more than a third of the produce grown in the United States, supporting crops valued at more than $20 billion a year, which is exactly why a mite you can't see developing resistance to a chemical you've trusted for a decade can turn into a $600 million problem for an entire industry almost overnight. This wasn't the industry's first brush with exactly this kind of structural failure. 80 honey farms, one of the two or three largest beekeeping operations in the country, built roughly two-thirds of its revenue on almond pollination contracts. Back during the original colony collapse disorder event in 2007, it lost 90% of its hives in a single season. The lesson wasn't that anyone had been careless. Colonies were fed, treated, and trucked exactly the way they'd always been. The lesson was structural. An operation that depends on a living inventory can lose the majority of that inventory in a matter of weeks for reasons that have nothing to do with how well it was managed the year before. 80's answer afterward wasn't to abandon migratory pollination. It was to rebuild the entire operation around a hard internal target of keeping annual losses under 18%, roughly half the industry's long run average. Because in this business, survival is a numbers game played against your own mortality rate year after year, forever. So let's do the unit economics out loud, because this is where the plan either holds up or falls apart. A complete colony costs roughly $200 to establish. Direct annual operating costs, feed, mite treatments, occasional requeening, run somewhere around $70 to $90 per colony on top of that before you've added a single mile of trucking or an hour of labor. Call it $290 in all in direct cost per colony in year one. Against that, a stacked migratory colony earns somewhere between $385 and $430 across a season. Do the subtraction and you get a gross margin of roughly $100 to $140 per colony before you've paid for the truck, the fuel, the land, the insurance, or a single hour of your own labor. Multiply that thin per colony margin across a real operation and stack it against reported beekeeper earnings. Commercial operators are commonly reported earning somewhere between $30,000 at the entry level and $70,000 or more once a fleet reaches meaningful scale. And you start to see why this business rewards scale and logistics far more than it rewards a bigger jar of honey. That's the good news. Here's what burns through it. That margin assumes every colony survives the season. It doesn't account for the mortality rate. And the mortality rate is not a small number sitting quietly in the background. Commercial beekeepers reported winter losses of 37 and 6/10% in the 2023 to 24 season alone, the highest on record for that survey group at the time, before 2025's crisis pushed losses past 60% for many operations. Every dead colony has to be replaced at roughly $200 before it can earn a single dollar again. That's not growth, that's running in place. Spending your entire season's thin margin just to get back to the number of colonies you started with in January. This is why so many operations that look profitable on a spreadsheet are one bad mite season away from a loss. The margin per colony was never large to begin with. It was built to be thin and to work only if the loss rate stayed in the historical range. The moment that rate doubles, as it did in 2025, the arithmetic that made this whole business work quietly inverts, and you find yourself spending money to replace inventory instead of collecting a check for renting it out. There is a second revenue stream sitting inside the same operation, and it has genuinely better margins than either honey or pollination rentals. It's selling the bees themselves. A strong colony can be split in spring into a nucleus colony, complete with a laying queen and drawn comb, and sold for $90 to $150. Or you can sell a mated queen alone for $24 to $75, or a queen cell for as little as $5 to $8. Unlike a jar of honey, which competes on a shelf against a market flooded with cheap imports, a nuc or a queen sells directly to another beekeeper who needs exactly what you're selling and has almost nowhere else local to get it. But this revenue stream has a hard ceiling built right in it, and the ceiling is your own pollination fleet. Every colony you split into a nuke to sell is a colony that isn't out on an almond contract that same season. And every queen you pull to sell is one fewer productive queen heading into your own strongest hives. Push too hard into breeding and selling bees, and you've quietly shrunk the very pollination fleet that was generating your best margin in the first place. The ceiling isn't demand, it's your own inventory. So let's put the two futures side by side. In the optimistic scenario, colony losses stay close to the long run historical average rather than the 2025 spike. Honey holds near its 2025 price of $3.05 a pound, and every colony gets stacked across almond pollination plus one follow on contract before coming home to make honey. A 200 colony operation run this way clears a healthy owner take home well above its direct cost break even, with the room left over for the truck payment and a bit of savings. In the realistic scenario, nothing dramatic happens. No fire, no scandal, no single bad decision anyone can point to. Losses run at the high end of normal instead of the low end, the way they did in the winter of 2023 into 2024 at nearly 38%. Replacing those colonies mid season, right before the grading inspection, eats into cash that was supposed to cover fuel and labor. And the honey that does get produced has to compete on price against a market where roughly three-quarters of the honey sold in this country is imported. And independent testing has found close to half of sampled imported honey cut with corn or beet syrup, undercutting what an honest domestic jar can fetch, even at the wholesale price of around $3 a pound, let alone the roughly $3.60 to $3.70 a retail customer might pay for the same jar at a farmer's market. No single one of these is a catastrophe on its own. Compounding quietly month after month, they're the difference between a comfortable year and a year where the spreadsheet, by December, looks nothing like the plan you made in January. So if you decide to keep bees for a living, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you make money at it. It was never really about how well you could keep bees alive in a box, and it was never really about the honey at all, no matter how good that honey is. A beekeeping operation was never a honey farm. It was always a fleet of migrant labor with wings, trucked from bloom to bloom, surviving mites, theft, and a market flooded with cheap imports along the way. And the ones who got rich weren't the ones who made the best honey. They were the ones who owned the root.